So with the release of Strixhaven, I dug more into making some more budget decks over the weekend. I kind of came up with a couple more. One solely based on almost all Strixhaven cards, while the other two are kind of using some of the newer cards we have that are on the budget side, and then adding them into some, past decks that I've covered here on the channel, adding them to those decks and kind of seeing how they play out. Overall, each of the decks are kind of unique on what they're trying to do here, but I do enjoy the way they've kind of worked out with these new additions in that manner. But overall, I mean, each Strixhaven's an interesting set, and the overall cards there are in the set, I in weird way kind of feel very limited based on what schools you're looking for. So a lot of the friendly colors, I would guess, are kind of more similar. But with that being said, guys, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, want to know I post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But let's dive into the decks and let's talk about it. So this first deck up on the list is actually a deck that I actually really enjoyed back for rotation last year, and that was Azorious Flyers, and it had a card called Rally the Wings, which essentially gave your flying creatures, I believe, +2/+2 and untapped all of them. And unfortunately, that card rotated out, and the card kind of lost its, its like emphasis or tempo with that. I mean, we did get, Mankind Stampede, which is a 5-mana card that is kind of similar, but it doesn't untap your creatures, and it's also sorcery, so you can't really catch your opponent off guard. You're just going to have to commit to it before attacking. But that's kind of like one of our finishers in the deck. But overall, the deck is playing a bunch of flyers, and we kind of added in some of the Kaldheim cards, because I don't think I've covered this deck when Kaldheim was out. And we actually added in one new card from, Strixhaven, which is the Dream Strix. So we are playing a sideboard that has lesson cards in it for that purpose. But overall, I mean, the deck is kind of like one of those tempo decks, and it kind of utilizes a little bit of Foretell and a little bit of the Learn, but not too much in that sense. But overall, the deck is pretty straightforward what it's trying to do. If you've seen any sort of blue-white or any decks that are kind of like the tempo like this, what we're trying to do is we're trying to build up a board, pecking our opponent, for little bits of damage here and there, trying to set up for a big, stampede or something like that. The way we do so is we play the 1-drop Raptor. It's a 1/2 flying for a striker, which is pretty decent overall card. Just getting some avoidance by being in the air is pretty good. And also for a strike, it seems like a pretty decent benefit. We're also playing Sentinel's Eyes because the idea of giving something +1/+1 and Vigilance is actually pretty decent. Especially something even like a Battlefield Raptor or any of our other flyer creatures. +1/+1 and Vigilance is pretty good. Plus, I mean, if we do end up playing something like a Rogue's deck, the idea of having an escape card if this gets put into the graveyard overall makes it pretty good. Follow that up, we have Clarion Spirit, which in itself is not actually a flyer, but what it does is actually produces flyers. So every time we cast a second spell during each of our turns, we create a 1/1 white spirit token. And overall, the curve of our deck is not super expensive, so there are going to be a lot of circumstances where we are going to play multiple spells on the same turn. So we'll be able to produce additional flyers, which will actually help us out in that sense, which is always a good thing. Then, of course, because we are playing flying, we do play Lofty Denial, being a 2-mana counter target spell unless this controller pays 1, and then if we control a creature flying, we counter it unless they pay 4. So definitely a good tempo kind of counter spell, especially for this flying style deck. Then we got 2 copies of Skycat Sovereign. This is something you definitely can boost up to 4 copies. I just put 2 copies in because I didn't want to go too heavy on the rares, because I do like for my budget video decks, for the most part, to keep it at 4 rares unless it's like one of those free rares you get when you kind of do the starter decks. But we have 2 copies of Skycat Sovereign, but this is definitely a 4-copy kind of card once you do kind of get more rare wild cards and maybe craft them. But it gets +1/+1 for each other creature we control with flying, and we can, for 4 mana, we can actually create 1/1 white catbird creature tokens with flying. So essentially, we can help itself by making more creatures with flying, which is always a good thing. Then we got Stagger and Insight for that kind of tempo, kind of curve thing. 2 mana, +1/+1, have lifelink, and then whenever we deal combat damage to a player, draw a card. So just that overall, keeping that tempo going, which is always a good thing for this style of Flyers deck. Next card up is got Watchers of the Spheres, which essentially is like one of our, I guess, flying lords in a way. Not in the sense that it's going to give our flying creatures +1/+1, but in the sense that it makes all our flying creatures cost 1 colorless less. For the most part, most of our flyers are, solid mana. You can't really go less than that. But I do like the idea here that it's in itself that whenever a creature we control with flying enters the battlefield under our control, it gets +1/+1 to end a turn. You kind of combine that with something like a Clarion Spirit, which in itself can create 1/1 tokens every time we play a second spell. It's just definitely one of those things. Also Skycat Sovereign also pumps this up. So it's just a decent benefit kind of combo thing that kind of goes along with what we're trying to do in the deck. Look at the Dream of the Strix. It's a 3-mana 3/2 flyer that's from Strixhaven. It's a flyer, of course. When it becomes a target, the spell sacrifice it, which is kind of unfortunate. Even if you decide to counter the spell that they're targeting with, it's still going to get sacrificed. So it's one of those things I'm not really sold on 100%, but it's something I am messing around with just for this purpose of just trying to see how it plays out. That's why I only went with 2 copies of it. I don't think you really want to go with any more of it, just on that sense that it's okay, but it's not great. But when it dies, we actually get to learn, so that's why we do play our learn sideboard, which I'll go over after I go over the rest of the cards. So it's an overall pretty decent card, just being a 3-mana 3/2 flyer, and the learn ability. We also are playing Saw It Coming to kind of, give ourselves a little bit of that tempo as well, setting it up for future counters in the later game for cheaper, straight up 2-mana counter target spell, or if we pay for its full cost, 3-mana counter target spell. Then we have the Jubilant Skybounder. It's a 3-mana 2/2 flyer. What creatures we control with flying have spells your opponents cast that target creature we control costs 2 more to cast. So essentially, our opponent has to pay more, or they're taxed in order to, move a target spell, unless they do like a sort of a board wipe ability or a sense. But it's definitely a good thing to kind of, protect our flyers in a way if we want to, keep things out on the board if our opponent is playing a lot of single target removal. Then we play Vega the Watcher. It's a 3-mana 2/2. It's nothing super amazing, but it's something I wanted to mess around with as well, just because it's another flyer. And then whenever we cast a spell that's anywhere other than our hand, we have to draw a card. So it actually sets up pretty well with our things that we play, with Foretell. So definitely one of those interesting things there that we can definitely take advantage of. But we're only playing 2 copies because, it's one of those things that, he's okay, but he's not great in the sense that, he does cost 3 for only a 2/2. But this secondary ability to have some additional draw is pretty good. Then we got Behold the Multiverse, which is a 4-mana, scry 2, then draw 2. Definitely a very good tempo card. There are things that are from the starter decks I was thinking about playing, but, to keep it standard legal and not play any of those arena cards that are arena legal, I guess, I decided to just stick with the sets instead of playing the starter deck cards. But this card's pretty good. The ability to foretell it and set it up in a later turn, maybe when you really need those 2 cards. And then being able to scry before you draw is always a good card. Then, like I said in the beginning of this deck, we got the Makandi Stampede, which kind of sets us up, for a big attack if we have a lot of, 1/1s and things like that, especially if we get very wide. +2/+2 is definitely a good way to put a lot of pressure on our opponent, and especially if we've been pretty aggressive up to this point. Our opponent could be very low, and they may not be able to block all that damage incoming. As well as we can always play it on the battlefield tapped as a land, which is something we're not really looking to do, but if we really, really need to get that additional white mana source, this is something we can do. And then the mana base overall is pretty straightforward. We got 8 plains, 9 islands. We have 2 of the Gates of Itzfell. It comes in, the reason why I decided to play this is because the idea here that in the later game, if we really need to draw more cards, if we haven't really drawn too much, we can always sacrifice it and gain 2 life and draw 2 cards for 5 mana, which is definitely pretty good, and we'll probably more than likely have that mana, so it's always good to just dig that little bit deeper into our deck. And then we have 4 copies of Tranquil Grove. Just one of those things that are also pretty good in the deck, just to kind of help us gain that 1 additional life. Also produces white and or blue mana, which is also very good. The one downfall to this deck that I would say that comes from Strixhaven is that there's no white and blue tap land, which is kind of a unfortunate thing. Just because there are the tap lands that you get from Strixhaven, and because this is kind of like the Temple V style deck, we don't get a one of those tap lands that actually you can tap 4 mana and scribe 1 card, which is definitely very good. But if you do have rare wild cards, you can always put like a copy or 2 of Castle Vantress in the deck, which is a 4 mana scry 2. So it's one of those things that's a decent payoff, but it's one of those things. But this is overall pretty decent deck. It can be very good. You can draw very well. You can get a pretty aggressive board out pretty quickly. And like I said, the deck overall is not super expensive when it comes to cost of creatures, so you can definitely put a lot of pressure on pretty quickly. And just looking for that, that finisher when it comes to the Stampede, or just a very big, Skycat Sovereign or something like that. With that being said, let's move on to the next deck and let's talk about it. Real quick before we move on to the next deck that I kind of forgot. The sideboard for the Learn cards, we have Environmental Sciences, just for the idea, in case we're kind of in a weird mana spot, we can always search our library for a basic land card, put it in our hand, and gain 2 life, which is definitely very good. I put an Inkling Summonins here just because we can create a 2/1 white-black flyer, just to go along with our fly-in style deck. Like I said, in Strixhaven, there's really not much in the way of blue-white things, so, this is, I thought, was a decent replacement there. And then we also have the 3 cost Expanded Anatomy, which is definitely another interesting card here. We get to put 2+1/+1 counters on target creature, and then make it gain in Vigilance, which is also pretty decent, which pumps up maybe one of our smaller bird tokens or something like that, and then makes it much larger, and then we can attack it aggressively, and then also keep it back for blocks, and giving it 2+1/+1 counters also very good. But like I said, with that being said, let's move on to the next deck. So this next deck is something I've kind of already built once before. This one probably has a little bit more in the way of Strixhaven and what it's trying to do, but it is a budget Boros Doors deck. Overall, the idea of the deck is we're playing some snow mana, and we're playing a lot of Dwarves in a sense, just trying to, you know, be aggressive with Dwarves and playing some interesting things. I do think my other one was more of like a Dwarves Warriors or more on the Boros side. Whereas this one's just trying to take advantage of just, you know, something like Magda of the Brazen Outlaw. Essentially, whenever we tap a dwarf, we get to create a treasure token, which we have a couple different ways to take advantage of and kind of produce some additional mana just for free without really having to attack in with them to not be as aggressive depending on what our opponent does have on the side of the board. But other than that, I mean, the deck is pretty straightforward. We are playing Frostbites in the deck because we do play snow in our mana source, so that's definitely very good. There's a good chance that we can usually get it to, you know, the 3 or more snow permanents, so we do the 3 damage, but, you know, just 2 damage for 1 is always very good to target creature or planeswalker. We then play Magda of the Brazen Outlaw. It's a 2 mana, 2/1. Other dwarves we control get +1/+0. Whenever a dwarf we control becomes tapped, create a treasure token, sacrifice 5 treasure tokens, search your library for an artifact card or a dragon card, put that card onto the battlefield, and then shuffle your library. Which is definitely also very good in the sense that we can always search our library up for a particular equipment card or something like that. We do play a few of those in our deck. We also do play vehicles as well, so we can always search for a vehicle. We don't play any dragons though, which is something you can always throw in there. Like I said, I always like to keep it at 4, and I think all the good dragons are rares or mythics. So I didn't really want to be too aggressive in playing too many rares, but you could always maybe put in like maybe 1 or 2 rares or mythics. I do think there's a new dragon that's from Strixhaven that I do think you can put in the deck. I just don't know exactly what its ability is, but I mean, let me know if you do decide to put a dragon in, which one you do put in, and tell me how it does. Then we follow it up. We got Rimrock Knight. It's another, you know, dwarf that's very good. You see a lot of cards from Throne of Eldraine. It's just a very solid dwarf with 2 mana, 3/1, can't block. But the first ability is called Boulder Rush. Target creature gets +2/+0, so it makes us be more aggressive against our opponent. Definitely very good there. We got 7 Dwarves, but we're only playing 4 copies, just because I wanted to fit in a couple of the newer cards in the deck, so I decided to only play, you know, 4 copies. But if you decide to cut things down, you can always play up to 7 copies of this card into your deck, and it gets +1/+1 for each other card named 7 Dwarves in your on the field. So it's definitely a card that is better in numbers, but I just decided 4 copies is okay here. Then we got Cole the Forge Master. It's a 2 mana 2/2. Whenever another non-token creature we control dies, if it was enchanted or equipped, return to its owner's hand. And creature tokens we control have +1/+1 that are enchanted or equipped as well. Like I said, we do play enchantments and equipments, and we do have a couple ways to make some tokens. So definitely a good card there because it does add some benefits to our tokens that we are producing. They were messing around with Rip Apart. It seems like a pretty interesting card in the sense that it's choose one. So depending on what the situation is, we do have multiple things we can do. So for 2 mana, white and a red, we can deal 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker, or decide to destroy target artifact or enchantment, which is also very good. The downfall is it is sorcery, so it is on the slower end, so we'll have to do it on our turn. But it's one of those things, like, depending on the matchup, we may have, you know, a use for it, regardless of our opponent playing, you know, an aggro deck and or a control deck that may play artifacts and or enchantments, which is also pretty good. We got Bearded Axe, 3 mana equipment. That's definitely very designated towards dwarves, in the sense that we get equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each dwarf equipment and or vehicle control, and then we can equip it to target creature for 2 mana. So this thing can get very big pretty quickly, just because the deck, like I said, is very low on curve. So it's definitely, you know, we don't have a lot of things that cost a lot of mana. And like I said, we do have a few ways to kind of get additional mana and kind of ramp a little bit without really having to have a ton of land on the battlefield. So definitely a good way that we're definitely going to get this, you know, this creature that's going to be equipped pretty beefy pretty quickly. Then we got the Dwarven Hammer, which is another equipment from Call Time. It's whenever it enters the battlefield, we pay 2 if we do create a 2/1 dwarf. And we can attach this hammer to it. Equipped creature gets +3/+0 and has trample, which yet again for this deck, being very aggressive, definitely very good here. Even if the creature isn't this token and you equip like one of your actual creatures, combine that with Cole, that creature is now going to bounce back to your hand if your opponent just tries to destroy it in some sort of way. So definitely pretty good there. They're playing Gilded Assault Cart. It's a 5/1 vehicle that has trample and has an ability called Crew 2. For most of the part, most of our dwarves and are, you know, 2 power or more. So definitely going to be able to tap this and kind of activate it pretty quickly. And this is actually where the crew ability actually is pretty decent in that sense. So you can tap to get to 2 or more, So this is actually pretty interesting. Even on the turn that you play it and you can't attack in with it because it has Summon and Sickness, so you can't attack in with it immediately. At the end of your opponent's turn, depending on how many Dwarves you out on the battlefield, you can always tap them down, combine that with Magda. You can then produce free mana in that sense by activating this, by making it a creature. So if you have 3 Dwarves down the battlefield, you activate it, you make 3 treasure tokens with the Magda's ability, and you're already stacking treasure tokens, which is definitely very good. So definitely a very interesting card. Crew 2 is pretty cheap. Like I said, most of the cards in our deck are 2 power and greater, so this definitely will get activated relatively quickly. And then the secondary ability on the card is if it does get destroyed, we can return to our graveyard to our hand if we just sacrifice 2 creature tokens. So Magda plus this card are pretty much a good combination together. Then we got Dwarven Reinforcements. What's an interesting card in the deck? It's one of the cards from Call Time. It produces Dwarf tokens, 2 of them that are 2/1s, and we can foretell it, so we can set it up in the later game. So definitely very interesting there. So overall, it's one of those things that we're going to set up, maybe get some additional tokens, get a little bit wider. Combine that with something like Chords of the Forge Master or Magda, we can definitely get very aggressive pretty quickly. So this is actually the card that kind of came from Strixhaven that got me interested in going back to Dwarves, and that's actually Stormkiln Artist. It's a Dwarf Shaman, and it gets +1/+0 for each artifact we control. And you combine that with the artifacts that Magda's making by the treasure tokens, and this thing can actually get pretty beefy pretty quickly. The other thing too, it has an ability with Magecraft that whenever we cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, we get to create a treasure token. So the deck does play, various, instants and sorceries like Frostbites, and we also got the Boulder Rush from Rimrock Knight. So there are definitely ways that we're going to be able to pump this guy up pretty quickly. Also, we got Dwarven Reinforcements, and we also have the Reconstruct History. So definitely ways that this card is going to get pretty beefy pretty quickly. So it's definitely one of those cards, even though it's a 4 mana for this ability, it probably will come out on the battlefield at a decently larger power size than it is toughness. So that's the only one downfall. Its toughness is on the weaker end, but it's one of those cards that are definitely very interesting to mess around with and kind of see how it does. And then the last card is that I briefly talked about just 2 seconds ago was Reconstruct History. This is actually a very interesting card. We get to return up to 1 target artifact card, up to 1 target enchantment card, up to 1 target instant card, and up to 1 target sorcery card, and up to 1 target planeswalker card from our graveyard to our hand, and then we exile it. So essentially, if our opponent does some sort of board wipe, in a sense that most of our cards go to the graveyard, we can always get one of each cards that we may have played earlier in the game back to our hand, essentially kind of restocking and kind of restarting up our aggressiveness on the battlefield, which is definitely very good. Even if we're playing against rogues, this is definitely a good way to get back anything our opponents may have milled that we may want. So that's also very interesting here. I kind of messing around with 2 copies for now, just because it's one of those things that you don't need 4 copies of, because you're not going to do this all the time. But 2 copies is decently pretty decent, and allows us to be a little bit more aggressive, just in that ability that we can get things back in case they get removed in the graveyard. And then of course we have the 1 copy of Embercleave, because why not? We're playing an aggro aggressive dwarf deck, so might as well have Embercleave in here. The other thing that's actually very interesting that I kind of didn't go over is that when we sacrifice the 5 treasure tokens, we get to search our library for an artifact or card, and we get to put that card on the battlefield, then shuffle. So the idea here is you actually, and when we're attacking very aggressively, maybe our opponent is low, you can always search up for an Embercleave, and then the ability of Embercleave when it comes onto the battlefield actually activates. So in that sense, it immediately attaches to whatever creature we want to on the battlefield, and then that creature has +1/+1 and double strike and trample. So definitely a good way to finish off our opponent. Combine that with something like a Gilded Car, or even whatever is equipped to the Dwarven Hammer. It makes a very aggressive creature pretty quickly, and usually if your opponent has no way to react, your opponent's going to be dead more than likely, because the Dwarf by itself here is already a 5/1, and then combine that with Embercleave makes it a 6/1, so we're already attacking it for 12, or even here's also attacking it for 12. So definitely a very aggressive, very good card, I would say, overall. And kind of like this is kind of the unique kind of setup that it is here in the Dwarf deck. I mean, like I said, you can always mess around. If you don't like rip cards, you can always take them out. Maybe add in more 7 doors. Maybe you don't like as many coals. Maybe you want to go down to 2 copies, add in more. Maybe you don't want more copies of this. It's kind of one of those things, like I always say when I make these decks, it's kind of like, this is kind of like the blueprint, and you guys can always adjust based on what you like and what you don't like. And then, of course, in the mana base, we have 5 snow-covered plains. We have 3 copies of this Dwarven Mine, which is actually very good. In the sense that it creates a token when it comes down the battlefield, so it's always pretty decent to get some free creature with a card. 9 mountains, 4 meadows. We have 1 of the campus, which is always very good, allowing us to kind of scry and set up in a later game, especially if we're looking for a particular card or answer, maybe to kind of maybe try to win the game. And then we have 2 copies of the Windscarred Cracked. The reason why I'm actually only playing less of these cards is because I want to make sure I hit the snow, and playing 4 copies. 4 copies of this and then 3 copies of this. I don't want too many tap lands. The other thing too is Dwarven Mine can come in the battlefield tapped as well, unless we control 3 or more mountains. So that's the other thing. So Alpine Meadow counts as a mountain, as well as, you know, the mountains, of course. So we want to make sure we're trying to hit the mountains, so when we play this, it doesn't come into play tapped, and we definitely get the idea of, you know, the dwarf creature as well. But overall, this is the dwarf deck. Like I said, let me know what you guys think of it. I do actually, from what I played, you know, in the handful of games, it actually felt pretty good. I would say, you know, because we're on a budget, sometimes, you know, if your opponents play a higher value deck, sometimes you get outvalued. But for the most part, if you draw a pretty decent hand and you are pretty aggressive, you can definitely catch your opponent by surprise. Now, this last deck is actually an interesting deck that I actually saw CGB actually do, but he did, like, you know, a more built-up version. But we decided to do a budget version of the deck, and I actually decided to also add in a card that a viewer made a comment in the last video. I kind of forgot the viewer's name, but they actually were talking about, can I build a deck around this particular card? I guess they drafted it or pulled it in a seal, and it's definitely a very interesting card. But overall, this is called the Witherbloom combo deck. If you haven't seen it, essentially evolves around this ability that Witherbloom has, that it's called Magecraft. Whenever you cast a copy or instant sorcery spell, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So the idea here is we're going to try to make a lot of pest tokens with like various things. We have the Sedgemoor Witch in the deck, which will, whenever we cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, we create a 1/1 black-green pest creature token. When this creature dies, you gain 1 life. So we have a few decent ways to kind of produce some tokens. We also play Bastion of Remembrance, but I'm going to go through the cards individually one by one and kind of talk about them. It's also one of those things, if you want to see how it works out, I would recommend watching the CGB video to kind of get a general understanding of how this combo kind of goes off and how you can actually catch your opponent by surprise and kind of, you know, go in for a big hit. So the first card we have is Eye Twitch, and of course we are playing Learn in the deck. So when it's a 1/1 for 1 flyer, when it dies, we learn. So we do have a Learn sideboard, you know, here of some lessons that you can always pull out. You get the Valentin, Dean of the Vine, or Lisette, Dean of the Root. So this is actually very interesting. You get a 1/1 for 1 that has Menace and Lifelink, and if a non-creature token an opponent controls would die, exile instead. When you do, and we pay 2, we create a 1/1 green pest creature token with when this creature dies, gain 1 life. So that's actually very good. So it's one way to build up pest creatures whenever our opponent's creatures die. It also takes you know, advantage of our opponent's creatures dying and going to the graveyard. You know, your opponent like throwing away creatures maybe to block some of our creatures. So this is definitely a way to, you know, prevent them from doing so, or if they do that, like it kind of prevents like decks that like return things back from the graveyard if they do die. So that's always very good. And they get the set at the end of the Root, which actually is a very good card, especially if we start getting very wide with our tokens. But whenever we gain life and we pay 1, if we do get a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control, those creatures gain trample at the end of turn. So when we start really getting our sacrificing combo kind of working, we can definitely make some big creatures pretty quickly. So if you draw her in the later game, this is definitely a good way to finish off your opponent by attacking aggressively and making our creatures that much stronger. Then we play Village Rites, which is a 1-mana instant spell. As additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature, draw 2 cards. Don't mind the special art. I mean, I did pull 4 copies of this, but you can play it from the various sets that have been released prior. I do think it's in M21 as well as Call Time, so you can either play one of those versions. I just decided to play this art, or actually made this art automatically. I don't really remember how it worked out, but this is the thing. The thing is, this is one of those ways that we can sacrifice a creature and also draw 2 cards, so we can dig into our deck a little bit more aggressively. And that's something that, you know, sometimes Black does, where they have to sacrifice things to be a little bit more aggressive on what they want to do. So this is definitely a good way to kind of get that free sacrifice with this card and get cards out of it. Then we got Hunt for Specimens, which is a 2-mana, you know, card that essentially we create a 1/1 black-green pest creature token that you can kind of see here. I'm not going to read the ability again, but when it dies, you gain a life. And then, of course, it has Learn to go into our sideboard, go to our Learn cards, yada, yada, yada. So this is actually where the combo actually happens. So this card here is called Plumb the Forbidden. It's a 2-mana instant speed spell. As additional cost to cast this spell, you may sacrifice 1 or more creatures. When we do, we get to copy this spell for each creature sacrificed this way, and then we draw a card and lose 1 life. So this is actually where the combo actually starts going off. So you play this card with Witherbloom out or something like that. I would suggest Witherbloom being the one, because whenever we cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, our opponent loses 1 life and then we gain 1 life. So if we make, you know, if we have 4 pests out and we want to sacrifice all 4 of them, we make 4 additional copies of the spell. So this goes up to 5. Now our opponent's going to lose 5 life. We're going to gain 5 life. We're also going to lose 1 life each copy of this spell. So we're going to lose 5 life, but we're going to also draw 5 cards. Combine that with something like Donna the Soul Steeper, which is the next card up, or the second to next card up. But whenever we gain life, each opponent loses 1 life. So this is kind of like a Dovin's Veto built into like an uncommon, but for black-green. So definitely interesting there. And then on top of that, we also have a card like this, Blood Researcher. Whenever we gain life, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on Blood Researcher. Then combine that with something like Bastion of Remembrance. Whenever, you know, a creature we control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and we gain 1 life. Combine that with the Sedgemoor Witch. You know, whenever we cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, we create a 1/1 black-green pest creature token. So in a weird way, it creates this weird loop of, you know, producing tokens, drawing cards, hitting our opponent for X amount of damage and life, us gaining X amount of life, creatures getting pumped up. So definitely a pretty interesting deck, and it all just kind of, you know, stems from this card and some of the other cards we have in our deck. Like I said, we have Bayou Gruff, which is another interesting card in here. It's also another interesting way to kind of, you know, sacrifice a creature. It is a 5/4 for 2 mana, which is actually on the cheap side. And, you know, you can always sacrifice a pest creature, or if you do draw this in the later game, you can always pay the additional 3 and get a 5/4 out of it, which I don't think is too bad. 5/4 is pretty beefy, and if you do get it out early, I mean, a 5/4 is hard for your opponent to deal with unless they have a direct removal. So definitely a good card there. But like I said, I only have 2 copies in here just because it can feel sometimes clunky if we're not really drawing, like, you know, a pest or a little token that we want to throw away pretty quickly. But overall, pretty decent card. Then, like I said, we have Dinah the Soul Steeper. It's a 2 mana 1/3. Whenever we gain life, each opponent loses 1 life. We can tap 1, we can sacrifice another creature. Dinah gets +X/+0 into end of turn, where X is the sacrifice creature's power. So that's actually one of those things too, if we're attacking aggressively towards the later game. Maybe our opponent's blocking a certain way, but they leave Dinah open. We can always sacrifice one of those creatures that our opponent's blocking, pump her up, and get that additional power to get that additional damage in. So definitely interesting there, and just another outlet to kind of have a sacrifice ability if we don't draw one of our spells that sacrifice a creature. But like I said before, we get Witherbloom Apprentice. Essentially, it's a 2 mana 2/2 with the ability that, you know, makes our opponent lose life, we gain life kind of thing whenever we play a instant sorcery or a copy of a spell. Bastion of Remembrance is actually a pretty interesting card in the deck. It definitely, you know, pings your opponent very pretty quickly if your opponent's not very careful and, you know, letting us trump with a lot of our tokens. But essentially, you know, when it comes in the battlefield, we create a 1/1 white soldier creature token. Whenever a creature token dies, our opponent loses life, we gain a life, so definitely good there. And then any creature that dies going forward is going to, you know, trigger the 1 life gained, 1 life lost for your opponent. So definitely very good in that sense as well. So definitely makes it, when your opponent starts getting down to like 10 or less life, they're going to get very, you're going to have to strategically think about how aggressive they want to attack in, unless they, you know, of course, the one downfall to this, we don't really have flyers other than Eye Twitch. So that is the one downfall to the deck, is that we don't have any in the air blockers. And like I said, we have Sedgemoor Witch. I did actually use her in another video, which was the last budget video where I put her in a black-white Orzhov Warlock deck. But in here, she really makes pest tokens, so I think her home's really in this style of deck. But she's a 3 mana 3/2 with Menace, and then has a ward, pay 3 life. So if your opponent does decide to target with a spell, you can always, you know, your opponent has to pay 3 life or the spell gets countered. And then Magecraft, whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, create a 1/1 black-green pest creature token. And essentially, you know, once we start sacrificing a plum, we essentially, you know, rebuild back up whatever we're sacrificing. Depending on how many times we copy this, we'll get X amount of copies of pests back onto the battlefield. So it's just a good way to kind of, you know, refeed the tokens back onto the battlefield. So just overall pretty good. And like I said, the last card is a Blood Researcher. So it's like the card that benefits from us in all this life, because we'll get additional +1/+1 for every time we gain life, which is always very good. And it has Menace too, so your opponent has to block 2 creatures into it if they really want to prevent the damage, which is also very good in that sense. And then, like I said, there's not really any ways of removal. A lot of what our removal is, your opponents are going to have to start blocking, or their life total is going to start slowly taken away pretty quickly. So we want to be more on the aggressive side and hopefully draw into what makes the deck kind of tick. But the mana base is pretty straightforward. We have 13 swamps, 5 forests, 4 jungle hollows, and 4 Witherbloom campuses. You know, you could probably cut back a little bit on this. Maybe want some more, you know, green mana into the deck. But overall, the deck is more of a black deck with a splash of green to kind of do the multicolor cards. And the good idea with the campus is that it does scry 1 for 4 mana, which is always very good. But this is actually one of my favorite decks out of all the ones I've made so far, just because the deck, even in a budget form, does have pretty good synergy. And like I said, once you kind of get more rares, you can always build up the deck more with some of the more green-black rares. The one that kind of sticks out that I'm kind of interested in, to be quite honest, I'm really interested in seeing if this card is any good with this deck. Just an idea here is that, you know, whatever we may have sacrificed, if we sacrifice actual creatures, if we kind of, you know, flip it around and then all of a sudden get to, you know, recast those things, and we can do it at the end of our opponent's turn, so we can actually set ourselves up for our follow-in turn, as well as the Blex, the Vex, and Pest, just because other pests, bats, insects, snakes, and spiders we control get +1/+1, and whenever it dies, we gain 4 life, which is pretty good. And then we can always flip it around on the other side. We get to look at top 5 cards of our library. We put any number of them into our hand, the rest into our graveyard. You lose 3 life each card put into your hand this way. Just in a very aggressive card draw in a way, but I do like the idea here that this is the Blex is kind of like our pest lord. But with that being said, that is kind of the Witherbloom deck. And I'll talk about the lesson board here before I forget, like I did on the first deck. We have Necrotic Fumes as this is an idea to exile target creature or planeswalker that we really can't tack through. Containment Breach to destroy target artifact or enchantment. If it's 2 or less, we get a 1/1 Cream Pest creature token. And then we got 4 copies of Pest Summoning just to create some more pests onto the battlefield. And I mean, the Pest creature token itself is probably one of the cutest token cards, I think, out of, the set as a whole. But like I said, guys, if you liked the video, let me know down in the comments below what, deck maybe be your favorite. If there's something else that you've been playing that's more on the budget side, let me know. I always like to kind of get an idea of what you guys are playing. And if you want to know when I post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But I'll catch you in the next video.